My name is Andrew Dubois. I'm Citizen Science Coordinator for Jefferson County Open Space, and we're going to talk about snakes, specifically rattlesnakes. So in Jefferson County and the Front Range in general, we have 12 snake species, but documented in our open space parks only 8. And of those 8, only one that is dangerously venomous, and that is the prairie rattlesnake. One of the questions we get a lot about snakes and the danger they pose to people is which snakes in the state of Colorado are venomous. The good news in Colorado is that they're all rattlesnakes. There are 3 rattlesnakes in the entire state: the prairie rattlesnake, the desert Massasauga, and the midget-faded rattlesnake. But the only one that occurs in our area is the prairie rattlesnake. Rattlesnake identification in the Front Range can be a little bit tricky. There are a few species that can be confused easily with rattlesnakes, some more so than others. A few characteristics that you can use to clinch a rattlesnake identification from a safe distance include the presence of a rattle at the end of the tail. The rattlesnake's tail is going to be blunt at the end, and it's going to be tipped with a rattle most often, but rattles can be lost and broken. All of the other snakes that are present in the county are going to have a sharply tapering tail end. A rattlesnake's tail is going to end in a blunt nub that has the rattle mounted on top of it. Rattles are fragile, and they can be varying lengths. As they get longer, they are more subject to breaks as the snake goes about its life, and the rattle can become shorter or completely lost. However, one thing you can tend to see with the basal segment of the rattle is it's going to be dark colored and very shiny, even in young snakes. As far as the pattern on the snake, the head of the snake has 2 white or cream colored stripes on either side of the face. One is placed in front of the eye and the other is behind the eye. As far as the body pattern is concerned, rattlesnakes have a series of irregular dark blotches that run all the way down the back from behind the head to about 2/3 of the way down the body. And those blotches are edged in white or cream color. As you get toward the tail, the last third of the body, those blotches are going to gradually transition into a series of dark bands that lack that white edging until you reach the very end of the tail. There are a few other features that you can use to identify rattlesnakes that you may have heard. Rattlesnakes have vertically elliptical pupils. Some people call that a cat's eye. They also have a pit, thus pit viper, on their face that's placed between and slightly below the eye and the nostril. But these characteristics can't really be used from a safe distance to identify your snake. You're too close to the snake if you're looking at those things, unless you have a spotting scope or a telephoto lens. One of the questions we often get about prairie rattlesnakes is where to find them. What kind of habitat do they occur in? And these animals are habitat generalists. They can happen just about anywhere that is natural habitats. You can find them in plains grassland habitat, sand hills, montane woodlands, pinyon juniper woodlands, even gallery forests around rivers and other riparian areas. Generally, the only areas that they're going to completely avoid are perennially wet spots. They don't like to be damp all of the time, and they're going to avoid very high areas in the mountains, and they tend to disappear in areas where there's been significant land conversion or development. Microhabitats that snakes enjoy depend on the needs of the snake during a particular time of year. So if a snake is interested in basking, they're going to generally hang out on a south or southeast facing slope, sometimes on or near or slightly underneath a rock. However, they'll also occupy burrows. Mammal burrows are popular retreats. Crevices in rocks are also popular, and sometimes rock jumbles. They also tend to show up in tall clumps of grass that provides them with shelter, a nice moist, warm microclimate that's buffered against the outside temperature. Generally speaking, they're not going to be concentrated in any one area. The phenology of rattlesnakes, the timing of their life events in our area, has a big impact on where they tend to be found and what they tend to be doing. So in the winter, they tend to be at their most concentrated. They're going to be hanging out in smaller areas. As the snakes warm up in the spring, so generally in March, April, and early May, they're going to leave those concentrated areas and they're going to disperse out into their foraging ranges. And a foraging range for a rattlesnake is anywhere where they can find their prey, small mammals. The timing of those events changes throughout the season as well. If you're in the earlier part of spring, you're more likely to see snakes out during the daytime. As we move into summer and it gets warmer, snakes are going to start avoiding the heat of the day. They really don't like their body temperature to get up into the 90s. It makes them uncomfortable. So you start seeing them switch their activity to be more nocturnal. And they'll opportunistically bath. Sometimes you'll see them outside of that window, but for the most part, they're primarily going to be active at night. Then, as we move into fall, we see a similar temperature shift where the snakes are going to become more active during the day, less so at night. Once you get into November, most snakes are going to be getting back to their hibernacula, the place where they're going to be spending their winter, and they'll hang out there usually until the following March. But they're not underground during that entire period. If you have a nice warm day or a sunny day, even if the air temperature isn't particularly warm, you can still see snakes outside of their hibernacula even in December. Hibernacula for prairie rattlesnakes can look a lot of different ways. It's just a place where they can go to not freeze to death in the wintertime. That can be a deep crevice in a rock outcrop. It can be a jumble or pile of rocks or a talus slope. It can be a prairie dog colony, or it can be as inconspicuous as a small mammal burrow in the ground that you'd be hard-pressed to pick out in a grassland. As far as elevation, people often ask how high rattlesnakes occur or how high can you go to avoid seeing a rattlesnake. Rattlesnakes in Colorado have been documented up to about 10,000 feet. These higher elevation snakes, if they have access to prey and they have access to good overwintering sites, then there's no reason why they can't be in those areas. Another question that we receive a lot about rattlesnakes is, when is it too cold for snakes to be out? The pivotal body temperature for activity or inactivity for a prairie rattlesnake is about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's their body temperature, not the air temperature. Those can be different. So below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a snake is going to depress its activity and become dormant or lethargic. Above 50 degrees, the snake is going to want to be active and moving around. Snake activity seems to peak in the mid 60s to the mid 80s degrees Fahrenheit, but they are active outside of that window. That's just when they tend to crop up the most. Snakes will die if they get down to freezing temperatures. Their body temperature reaches 32 degrees. They're not going to be able to survive that. Similarly, they can get too hot. If their body temperature gets to be 100 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, their life is threatened. The ambient temperature is not necessarily a snake's body temperature, and snakes are able to regulate their body temperature using behavior. So whatever temperature it is outside isn't necessarily what the snakes are seeing. Even if it's a fairly cool day, if you are getting a lot of sun exposure, it's the ground temperature that matters more when determining whether you're going to be seeing snakes or not seeing snakes, because that allows the snake to warm itself up so that its body temperature is higher than the surrounding air. So there isn't a defined temperature window where you're guaranteed not to see snakes. One of the questions that we often get is, how many snakes are there in an area? And unfortunately, the total population of adult prairie rattlesnakes is not known. And a lot of that has to do with the difficulty in studying snakes. Snakes are hard to detect. They are small. They tend to have cryptic coloration where their camouflage is really well suited to their environment, so they're hard to see. Their behavior, their habits tend to make them hard to find. As a result of that, low detection, we know relatively little about the biology of these animals compared to other vertebrate species. There's an idea out there that baby or neonate young rattlesnakes are more dangerous than adult rattlesnakes. The explanation that's given is either that the venom is more toxic in those younger snakes, or that the snakes can't control their venom at a younger age. Venom tends to change its composition over the course of a snake's life. So a young snake often is going to have compounds that are considered more lethal than what you would see in an older snake. But as a snake grows linearly, the capacity of its venom glands increases exponentially, which is to say, as a snake grows, it can pack a lot more venom into its bites. And while an older snake may have a venom cocktail that's a little less toxic than what you would see in a younger animal, it's still going to be so much more venom than a younger animal can produce that the bite of an adult snake is almost certainly going to be more dangerous. However, venom composition also varies across geography, and as we continue to learn more about venom composition of different snake populations, it becomes harder to make generalizations. If snake repellents worked, then we would be touting them all the time. But unfortunately, behaviors that work on mountain lions, bears, coyotes, hazing behaviors don't tend to work on rattlesnakes. Rattlesnakes are not going to be able to interpret your behavior. They think that you are a predator, and they're going to defend themselves either by staying put and relying on their camouflage. They may try to flee and retreat from you if they know where they want to go, or they may stand their ground and rattle at you. Waving your arms is just going to make you bigger and more vigorous looking, so that's going to encourage the snake to hunker down. Throwing rocks at snakes is similarly going to guarantee that the snake is going to interpret your behavior as a threat to its life. And a snake, especially a rattlesnake, knows that it is relatively clumsy and slow for a snake. It's not going to be able to outrun you, the predator, and more often than not, a snake is going to try to dig in, hold its ground, and be defensive in an event where it's being harassed. The best thing, the safest thing that you can do in order to encourage a snake to move away from an area where you don't want it to be, for example, in the middle of a trail, is to leave it alone. A lot of concern comes from the idea that snakes are waiting to get you. And the thing about it is, snakes have nothing to gain from any interaction with a human being. It's all bad news for them. A snake that is interacting with you is doing so because it is trying to defend itself. For the most part, if you leave a snake alone, give it space, it's going to want to avoid any contact with you whatsoever. When we tend to see bites, it's often because people are getting in extremely close proximity to the animal. Because rattlesnakes are so dependent on their venom for them to acquire food, and venom is a fairly expensive resource for the snake to make, they don't want to waste it on you or your pet unless they feel like they have no other choice to save their own life. One misconception that people tend to have about snake behavior is that rattlesnakes will always rattle to let you know that they're around, and that's just not true. In cases where a snake is under cover, the snake is not as likely to rattle and give you a warning, so the odds of you stepping on a snake in cover are higher because they're less likely to warn you in that event. If a snake is out and exposed in the open, and it feels like it's out in the open and is going to be perceived by predators, it may be more likely to rattle in order to give you a warning, let you know that it's there. But that isn't even a guarantee.
I'm Mary Ann Bonnell. I'm the Visitor Services Manager for Jefferson County Open Space. I've also been studying prairie rattlesnakes for about 22 years. I really enjoy helping people understand how to change fear of rattlesnakes into respect of rattlesnakes. We want to talk about how you can be safe and how you can understand rattlesnakes in Jefferson County Open Space parks, because pretty much in every single one of our parks, with one or two exceptions, you are going to be sharing the trail and the park with rattlesnakes. So it's important for you to understand how you and your pet can be safe. One of the things that people often ask us is how common are rattlesnake bites? And if you look at our visitation, which is about 7 million per year, we estimate about 3 million dogs per year, we have a reported 2 to 4 bites to humans, as well as about 2 to 4 bites to dogs per year. And how serious are these bites? You should treat every bite seriously. Every bite needs to be either treated at a medical center, 911 for a human, or dogs need to be taken immediately to the vet. So a lot of people ask, what should I do if I see a snake on the trail? And there's a couple of things that we recommend. First of all, if you see a snake, the most important thing to do is to give that snake space. So take 2 giant steps away from the snake and then continue moving away from the snake to give it at least 20 to 30 feet. Why so much space? Because snakes are not going to attack you, but they do want to get away from you. You're perceived as a predator. If you're standing right over a snake, it's less likely that it's going to feel comfortable just slithering off the trail. So give that snake space and time to move off the trail and get out of the way. If the snake doesn't leave the trail and you're feeling like you absolutely need to move on, what we do recommend then is you can move around the snake. Do not attempt to jump over a snake. and do not attempt to move closely to a snake. You'll want to give that snake at least 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 feet if you can as you move around it. And that's the safest way to avoid a snake that's in the trail. One of the other things to keep in mind is if you do see a snake on the trail, it is absolutely not a good idea to try to throw rocks at that snake, poke it with a stick, or even more dangerously, try to move it. You should just let that snake be, give it space and time to move away from you. When people engage with rattlesnakes by throwing rocks or trying to move it, that's when people are hurt or bitten. Another common question that we get is, what should I do if I am bitten by a rattlesnake? So let's talk first about human first aid. If you or someone you're hiking with is bitten by a rattlesnake, the very first thing you want to do is remain calm. The calmer you can be, the less you're going to move that venom throughout your body. The next thing you need to do is call 911. If you don't have cell service where you are and you have someone with you, if they can walk to cell service and call 911, that's going to be the most important phone call you make. If you don't have cell service where you are and you don't anticipate someone coming by who can help you, then you're going to want to calmly walk towards a place where you can get a cell service. If you now have made that phone call to 911, what's really important is, can you describe exactly where you are in the park? Do you know which park you're in? Do you know which trail you're on? Do you know which intersection you just passed? You're going to want to accurately describe for first responders where you are so that they can come find you and they can come give you first aid. The next thing you need to do after you've made that phone call and you know that help is on the way is you need to remain calm, and you need to get whatever part of your body was bitten into a body neutral position. What that means is at the heart or lower. So if you were bitten on the foot or the ankle, which is our most common place where visitors are bitten, then if you can safely sit down, you need to sit down so that, again, you can keep your body as calm as possible. If you have the means to do it, if you can circle the bite area and put the time of day, that's going to really help first responders to, first of all, be able to locate the area of the bite. They're also going to be able to understand how much swelling and what kind of reaction you're having and how quickly that reaction is happening. So that's another important first aid item for humans. The next thing to do is just wait for help to get there. And as first responders come, they will help you with other symptoms. And again, the most important thing is to remain calm. When you look at first aid, one of the things that people ask about is, what is my reaction to the bite going to be? And there are so many variables that impact an individual's reaction to a bite. One of the biggest ones is, how much does that person weigh, and are they immunocompromised, or do they have allergies? The other thing is where you are bitten. If you're bitten on an extremity, on the toe or the ankle or your foot or your hand, that's going to be a little bit different than if you're bitten on the neck or the face, because again, that can have this immediate impact on your airway. Some other things that can impact an individual's response to a bite is how much venom the snake actually administers during the bite. So if you've been egging that snake on, if you've been poking it with a stick and throwing rocks at it, and you decide you're going to move it and it bites your hand, then you're going to get a lot more venom than a snake that's just simply surprised by you just accidentally walking up on it. So those are all variables that can play into how an individual responds to a rattlesnake bite. The damage that a rattlesnake bite can do also depends on the venom and the individual. Most of the prairie rattlesnake's venom, if they're an older rattlesnake, that venom is meant to digest tissue. So you're probably going to have a lot of tissue damage, a lot of bruising, you could have long-term loss of tissue. For a younger snake, their venom tends to be more neurotoxic, so you may have long-term nerve damage or temporary nerve damage. Again, very much dependent on the snake and you and how much venom you get in a bite. Beyond first aid for a rattlesnake bite, often people wonder what will happen once I get to the hospital. And where you are transported to depends a lot on where you're bitten. They'll probably take you to the closest location that stocks anti-venom. And anti-venom is fascinating. One of the things that's important to understand about anti-venom is it has to be stored or refrigerated, and it has to be diluted in order to be put into the human body. So it's not something that you can carry with you in your pack in case of an emergency. It needs to be stored and administered by medical professionals. So once you get to a hospital or an emergency response center, then they would, if they know you're coming, they'll be starting to warm up that anti-venom and they'll be starting to dilute it. And then you will get a dose, which is 4 to 6 vials, and how many doses you get and over how much time you get those will depend on your reaction. In addition to humans, one of the questions we get is, what should I do if my dog is bitten by a rattlesnake? Very important that a dog goes immediately to a vet. So oftentimes dogs are bitten on the nose or on the face or on the eye or the ear. And so they're under danger of, as swelling happens, losing their airway. So it's really important to get a dog to veterinary medical care as quickly as possible. What that means is if you can carry the dog so that the dog's not walking and moving that venom through its body, that's really important. If your dog is too big to carry, then you're going to want to walk your dog out. You may call and see if you can get assistance from animal control or rangers to help carry your dog out if your dog is no longer able to walk. That dog will need to get immediate veterinary medical care. Really important that you do that. Do not skip that step because the dog could, even though it's not showing any symptoms, could become gravely ill overnight. So you do want to have that dog observed by a doctor. One other thing to remember when you're transporting a dog who's been bitten by a rattlesnake, you do want to call ahead to whatever veterinary medical provider you're going to and let them know that you are transporting a dog for a rattlesnake bite. Not all veterinarians stock anti-venom because it is expensive and it's difficult to stock. One of the first things to keep in mind to avoid encounters with rattlesnakes is to stay on designated trails. It's not that snakes avoid trails or you're never going to see a snake on a trail, it's just that you're more likely to spot the snake and not accidentally encounter it if you are on a designated trail. The next thing that helps mitigate risk is appropriate footwear. I like to wear closed-toed shoes. I like to make sure that they come up above my ankle, because I know from interviewing people who've been bitten in our parks that the most common place where people are bitten is on the foot or the ankle. If you're wearing closed-toed shoes and they're high top, that sort of eliminates that option for the snake. I also like to wear long, loose-fitting pants so that if a snake were to strike at my leg, hopefully it just gets a fang full of pant rather than my actual leg. We also really encourage you to be aware of your surroundings. Wearing earbuds can really impair your ability to know you're getting too close to a rattlesnake. Rattlesnakes rattle not out of trying to allure anything, they're using that as a defense. They're trying to tell you you are getting too close. If you're wearing earbuds, you're not going to hear that rattle. So we do strongly encourage our visitors to at least wear one earbud out so you can hear that snake giving you that warning that you are getting too close. The next thing that's really important for mitigating risk is paying attention. So watch where you're going. If you're talking to a friend, make sure you're keeping your eyes on the trail, that you're not sort of walking and talking and looking around. Also, try really hard not to put your hands or your feet where you can't see. The next thing that's really important for safety and mitigating risk is keeping your dog on a leash. If your dog is running widely and sort of cruising around and exploring on its own, the chances of it nosing into a rattlesnake actually increase dramatically. And when we talk to vets who treat for rattlesnake bite, it's really important to understand that dogs that are off leash are bitten more frequently than dogs that are on leash. So having that dog on a leash is really important to mitigate risk. One of the things we love is when our visitors tell us about what they've seen or wildlife encounters that they've had. And we really appreciate those reports because it helps us to track where we need to be doing education and where we need to be providing additional information for our visitors. You can get onto our website or on your phone. On our website, you will find human-wildlife interactions under the Parks and Trails heading, and you can just go right in there and you can report any interaction that you have with a variety of species of wildlife, including rattlesnakes. Now, say you've never had an encounter with a rattlesnake, but you just want to find out where people have seen them. You can use that same web page. There's an interactive map that you can zero in on the park you're looking at, and you can see how many rattlesnake sightings have been reported by our visitors, and you can even read about them. And it does give you a good sense of where rattlesnake encounters occur in our parks. Let's talk about rattlesnakes and the law. One of the things that's important to understand is that in all Jefferson County open space parks, wildlife is protected. And so if you decide you want to kill a rattlesnake, that actually could get you a ticket, not to mention that it's incredibly dangerous. And so we ask you to leave the rattlesnakes alone. Killing a rattlesnake does not make you a hero. In fact, it makes you a fool. When it comes to rattlesnakes in Jefferson County open space, it's important to remember that bites are extremely rare. What we do want you to remember is that you could see a rattlesnake anytime. And so we want you to take these safety tips and these self-care tips to heart and be safe and respectful in rattlesnake country.